A man beat my daughter so badly she needed jaw surgery, and his rich family got him off with temporary insanity. So I gave him what he deserved, and my lawyer used the exact same defense. My daughter Kieran was 22 when it happened. She was leaving her evening class at the community college, and a man named Boyd Lachlan grabbed her in the parking structure and beat her so badly she had to have surgery on her jaw. She lost 2 teeth and had a fracture above her left eye. She spent 4 days in the hospital, and I watched her try to drink through a straw because she couldn't open her mouth wide enough to eat. Boyd was arrested the same night. Her professor found her and called the police while Boyd was still sitting in his car like nothing happened. It should have been open and shut. It wasn't. Boyd came from money. His father owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties, and the family hired a defense team that cost more than my house. The trial took 8 months. They argued Boyd had a dissociative episode triggered by a medication interaction and that he was not in control of his actions. They brought in 2 experts who said the episode was a one-time event caused by a temporary chemical imbalance. The prosecution pushed back, but Boyd's team buried them in motions and delays until the whole thing felt like it was happening underwater. The jury came back with not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Boyd walked out of that courtroom and hugged his mother on the steps. His father shook his lawyer's hand and they all went to lunch. My daughter was sitting 3 rows behind me with a scar above her eye that she will have for the rest of her life. After the verdict, I went home and sat in my garage for a long time. I'm a plumber. I've worked with my hands for 30 years. I'm not a violent man. I coach Little League on Saturdays and I go to church with my wife Rena on Sundays. But I sat in that garage and something in me just went flat. Not angry, flat. Like the part of me that followed rules and trusted the system just turned off quietly and didn't come back on. I waited 3 months. During those 3 months, I watched Boyd go right back to his life. He went back to work at his father's dealership. He posted about a fishing trip. He bought a new truck. My daughter was sleeping with the lights on and couldn't walk to her car alone without shaking. I found out where Boyd played pickup basketball every Thursday night at a gym near the east side. Boyd was not careful about his routine, and people talk in small towns. One Thursday evening, I showed up at that gym. I waited in the parking lot until Boyd came out at around 9. He was alone, walking to his truck with a gym bag over his shoulder. I got out of my car and I walked up to him and I hit him. By the time someone pulled me off, his face looked the way my daughter's face looked in that hospital bed. The police came and I didn't run. I sat on the curb and waited. They arrested me and I went without a word. Rena posted bail the next morning. Boyd's family wanted me buried. They wanted assault charges, maximum sentencing, civil damages, everything. My lawyer was a man named Finch, who I went to high school with and who watched the Lachlan verdict on the news. He told me afterward that if I ever needed anything to call him, I called him. Finch walked into our first hearing and entered a plea of not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The Lachlan side objected immediately. Finch presented a psychologist who testified that I'd been suffering from acute psychological distress since watching my daughter's attacker walk free. He used the exact same framework Boyd's defense used: temporary, involuntary, out of character, one-time event. He brought in my Little League parents who said I'd never raised my voice at a game in 6 years. He brought in my pastor who said I was one of the most even-tempered men he'd ever known. He brought in my co-workers who said I'd never once gotten into a conflict on a job site in 3 decades. Then Finch made the Lachlan team answer the one question they couldn't get around. If Boyd Lachlan could beat a woman he didn't know in a parking garage and walk free because of a temporary mental break, then how could they argue that a father who watched his daughter's attacker go unpunished was not experiencing the same thing? They couldn't answer it without dismantling the exact defense that got Boyd off in the first place. If temporary insanity was real enough to free Boyd, it was real enough to free me. Either way, one of those verdicts was wrong, and nobody in that courtroom wanted to be the one to say which. 2 days later, my boss called me into his office. A man in a nice suit had come by the shop asking questions about me. Did I have a temper? Had I ever damaged property on a job? My boss said he didn't answer any of it and told the guy to leave. I called Finch from my truck. He said the Lachlans had hired someone to go through my life like a filing cabinet, pulling out anything they could twist. Don't talk to anyone you don't know. That evening, I went to pick up Kieran for dinner. When she opened her door, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She was past crying. She told me a woman with a professional voice had called her that afternoon claiming to be doing a background check. She'd asked Kieran about my history of anger. She'd asked if Kieran had ever felt afraid of me. My daughter looked at me and said, "They're trying to make you into him. They're trying to make you into Boyd." She was right. That's exactly what they were doing. Then for the first time since the attack, she really looked me in the eye. "I'm glad you did it, Dad. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but I'm glad." That evening, my phone rang. It was Lawson. Lawson Hartman has been my pastor for 15 years. He married me and Rena. He baptized Kieran when she was a baby. He told me someone from a legal firm had called him that day and asked if he'd be willing to revisit his testimony. They didn't say it directly, but they implied that maybe there were things about my temperament he'd missed or forgotten, things that might paint a fuller picture. Lawson said, "I told them I said what I said and I meant every word, but I want you to know they're circling and they're not being subtle about it." I thanked him and told him I was sorry they'd dragged him into it. He told me not to be sorry and that he'd say the same thing in front of any judge in the country. Then a woman approached Rena in the parking lot at her job and asked her if she ever felt unsafe around her husband. Rena told her to get away from her. When she came home and told me about it, her voice was shaking. Not because she believed the question, because of where it happened. They came to her job. I felt that same flat switch from the night in the garage trying to come back. I pushed it down and called Finch. He said, "Write it all down. Every contact, every question. We're going to use all of it." Finch filed a motion documenting the whole pattern. Witness intimidation, harassment, a clear and coordinated effort. He told me, "They think they're weakening our case. They're actually building it. Every person they pressure is another person who can testify about who the Lachlans really are. They're so used to buying silence, they forgot what happens when people talk back." 2 weeks later, we had a pre-trial hearing on whether the temporary insanity defense was even allowed in my case. If the judge said yes, we had a real shot at trial. If he said no, the whole thing fell apart. Finch was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench outside the courtroom. He told me the Lachlans' lawyers had filed a 40-page brief late the night before arguing that my defense was a mockery of the court. Then Finch smiled smiled and said, "They literally cited their own case as precedent against you. I couldn't have written it better myself." When the courtroom opened, we walked in together. Boyd's father was in the front row, arms crossed. Boyd wasn't there. Finch stood and didn't waste any time. "Your Honor, the defense of temporary insanity has already been validated in this very jurisdiction by the Lachlan case. The state accepted this defense 7 months ago in this building. If it was sound enough for Boyd Lachlan, it is sound enough for my client." The Lachlan attorney was on his feet before Finch even sat down. He argued the two cases were not comparable. He said Boyd's case involved documented medical evidence and psychiatric evaluations conducted over several months. He said my case was built on emotion, not science. Finch stood right back up. "Then explain the difference. One man attacked a stranger in a parking structure. The other attacked the man who attacked his daughter." The judge held up his hand. The room went quiet. He leaned forward and looked directly at the Lachlan team. "I want to ask you something directly, counselor. Are you arguing that the defense used in the Lachlan case was improperly applied?" The lead attorney froze. Maybe 2 seconds. But in a courtroom, 2 seconds is a lifetime. If he said yes, he was admitting Boyd's verdict was wrong, which would open the door for an appeal. If he said no, he was handing Finch exactly what he needed. He started talking about the specifics of psychiatric methodology. The judge cut him off. "I asked a yes or no question, counselor." The attorney straightened his tie. He looked at Boyd's father in the front row. Then he looked back at the judge and said, "No, Your Honor, we are not arguing that." The judge took a few minutes and then made his ruling. He was allowing the temporary insanity defense to proceed. Boyd's father stood up in the gallery and said, "This is a joke." The judge told him to sit down or be removed. The next move didn't come from a lawyer. It came from Boyd. He showed up at my front door on a Tuesday evening while Rena was at the grocery store. I opened the door and Boyd Lachlan was standing on my porch. Just him. No lawyer, no father. He was wearing a collared shirt, clean shaven, looking like he was about to walk into a job interview. My whole body went tight. I wanted to step through that doorway and finish what I started in that parking lot. I didn't move. Boyd raised one hand slightly. "I'm not here to start anything," he said. "I just want to talk." I said, "You're on my property. You need to leave." He didn't move. "I know what you're doing with the trial. My dad's losing his mind over it." He looked down at his shoes and then back up. "I'm sorry about what happened to your daughter. The medication thing was real. I didn't choose to do what I did." I said, "You sat in your car afterward. You didn't call for help. You didn't check on her." He said, "I was confused. I didn't know what I'd done." I said, "You knew enough to sit down and wait." His jaw tightened. Then he said, "My family is willing to drop the civil suit. All of it. If you drop the temporary insanity defense and take a plea, 6 months, maybe less with good behavior. My dad says he'll make sure you don't do real time." That's when I understood. This wasn't an apology. This was a transaction. I said, "Your father sent you here." His expression flickered. "I came on my own." I said, "No, you didn't. You don't do anything on your own. That's your whole problem." His composure cracked. He took a half step forward and his voice dropped lower. "You broke my face, old man. You waited in a parking lot and you broke my face." I said, "You broke my daughter's jaw and you walked free. Get off my property." Boyd stared at me, and for the first time I saw who he really was. No confusion, no fog, just cold, clear anger. He stood there for 3 seconds and said quietly, "You're going to lose. My family doesn't lose." Then he walked down the steps and got into his truck. I closed the door and walked straight to the counter and called Finch. I told him every word. The apology that wasn't an apology. The deal. The threat. Finch was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said, "He came to your house, unsupervised, during active litigation, and he tried to broker a deal his lawyers didn't authorize. This isn't just evidence of contact. This is evidence of consciousness. A man who didn't know what he was doing that night doesn't come to your house to make deals about it. He knows exactly what he did. He always did." I sat at the table and wrote down every word. When Rena came home an hour later with groceries, I told her what happened. She set the bags down on the counter and stood there for a minute. Then she walked over and put both hands on my shoulders and said, "You didn't touch him. It wasn't a question." I said, "No, I didn't." She squeezed my shoulders and nodded. "Good," she said, "because he wanted you to." The next morning, Finch called me early. The Lachlan team had filed an emergency motion claiming I'd somehow lured Boyd to my home to manufacture a confrontation. Finch laughed when he told me, "I have your doorbell footage of him walking up alone, knocking, and you never once stepping off the threshold. Their motion is dead on arrival." Trial day 1 felt heavy. Jury selection took most of the morning. The Lachlan team used every challenge to remove anyone who looked like they might be a parent of a young woman. Finch leaned over and whispered, "They're scared of empathy. That tells you everything about their case." 8 people on the jury. The Lachlan lead attorney's opening painted me as a calculating vigilante who'd spent 3 months stalking Boyd. He used the word premeditated 6 times. I counted. He talked about how I researched Boyd's schedule, how I drove to the gym, how I waited. He made it sound like a mission. Then Finch stood up. He kept it short. He told the jury about Kieran, about the parking structure, about the hospital, about the straw she drank through because her jaw was wired shut, about the 8-month trial that ended with the man who did that to her walking free, about the 3 months after where a father watched his daughter's attacker go back to living his life while his daughter slept with every light on in her apartment. Then Finch said, "This courtroom found that Boyd Lachlan was not responsible for what he did because of a temporary break from reality. My client experienced the same thing. The only difference is that you can understand why." The prosecution went for 2 days. The officers who responded described me sitting on the curb afterward, calm, hands on my knees. Their psychologist said someone experiencing a genuine dissociative break doesn't plan for 90 days. Then they called Boyd to the stand. He looked calm and put together and sad in exactly the right way. Well coached. He said he was just walking to his truck after a game when a man he'd never met started hitting him. He said he was scared. He said he didn't do anything to provoke it. He said all he wanted was to move on with his life. A few people on the jury leaned forward in their chairs. When the Lachlan attorney asked him how he felt about my defense, Boyd said it felt like a mockery. What happened to him was a real medical event. What I did was revenge. I watched 2 jurors nod. After court that day, I sat in Finch's car and said, "He looked believable up there." Finch nodded. He did. He looked like exactly what his lawyers spent 6 figures teaching him to look like. Calm, hurt, reasonable. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a folder. Inside was the transcript of everything I'd told him about Boyd's visit to my porch. "Tomorrow, I'm going to ask Boyd about that visit. He's either going to lie about it under oath, or he's going to admit he came to a man's home during an active trial to intimidate him into a plea. Either way, the jury meets the real Boyd. That night, I sat in my garage again. Same chair, same spot where I'd sat after Kieran's attacker walked free. But I wasn't the same man anymore. That man was flat, empty, done with the system. This man had something working, a plan that was already forcing the Lachlan's into corners they couldn't buy their way out of. I thought about Boyd's eyes on my porch. No confusion, no fog, just a man who'd gotten away with something terrible and couldn't stand being held accountable. But I also thought about Boyd on the stand earlier that day. He was so good up there, so smooth. The jury didn't know about the 6 figures of coaching. They didn't see Boyd on my porch with that cold, flat look. All they saw was a young man in a nice shirt who sounded scared and sorry and like he just wanted his life back. And then they looked at me, a 53-year-old plumber who beat that young man so badly his face looked like raw meat. If I was sitting in that jury box and didn't know anything else, I'm not sure I'd be on my side either. Tomorrow, Boyd was either going to lie or he was going to crack. The next morning, Finch cross-examined him. He started slow, walked toward the witness stand with the folder in one hand, almost casual. He asked Boyd to describe his daily routine after the verdict. Boyd said he went back to work, spent time with his family, tried to get back to a normal life. Finch asked, "Did you think about Kieran Lucas at all during that time?" Boyd didn't hesitate. "Of course I did. I felt terrible." Finch repeated it back. "You felt terrible, but you went back to work, bought a new truck, went on a fishing trip." Boyd shifted. "I was trying to move forward. That's what my therapist recommended." Then Finch said, "Let's talk about the night you came to my client's home." Boyd's attorney was on his feet objecting. The judge allowed the question. Finch asked Boyd directly if he'd gone to my home 3 weeks ago. Boyd hesitated. "I went to try to talk. I wanted to see if we could resolve things." Finch tilted his head. "Did your lawyers know you were going?" Boyd looked down. "I don't remember." Finch took a step closer. "You don't remember if your lawyers, who you speak to multiple times a week, knew you were going to the home of the man you have an active case against?" Boyd swallowed. "I think I mentioned it." Finch turned, picked up a second document, and held it up so the jury could see the filing stamp. He read from it, the emergency motion that Boyd's own legal team had filed. Counsel for Mr. Lachlan had no knowledge of and did not authorize any contact between Mr. Lachlan and the defendant. Boyd's face tightened. His eyes moved to his attorney like he was looking for a lifeline. The judge told Boyd to answer. He said, "I went on my own. I just wanted to talk." Finch asked, "What did you say to my client at his front door?" Boyd said, "I told him I was sorry about what happened to his daughter." Finch said, "Is that all?" Boyd said, "That's the main thing." Finch opened the folder, the one with everything I'd written down. He read in a clear, even voice. "Your family is willing to drop the civil suit if he drops the insanity defense and takes a plea. 6 months, your dad says he'll make sure he doesn't do real time." Finch looked up. "Did you say those words?" Boyd shifted. "I might have mentioned that there were options." Finch closed the folder slowly. "Options. You went to a man's home during an active trial, without your lawyer's knowledge, and offered him a deal to abandon his defense." A couple of jurors leaned forward. Finch took 2 steps to his left and stood directly in front of the jury box. Then he turned back to Boyd and asked the question. "Boyd, on the night you attacked Kieran Lucas in that parking structure, you testified during your own trial that you had no memory of the event, that you were in a dissociative state and didn't know what you were doing. Is that still your testimony?" Boyd said, "Yes." Finch nodded slowly. "Then why did you tell my client on his porch, and I quote, 'You broke my face, old man'?" The courtroom went still, not quiet, still. Finch kept going. "If you had no memory of attacking Kieran, how did you know enough to be angry about what happened to you? How did you know it was retaliation? How did you know to come to his house and offer a deal? A man with no memory of what he did doesn't negotiate about it 3 months later." Boyd opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His eyes went to his attorney. His attorney stood to object but said nothing and sat back down. Finch said, "You remember everything, Boyd. You remembered it the night it happened when you sat in your car afterward. You remembered it during your trial. You remembered it when you came to my client's house. The only time you didn't remember was when it was convenient for you not to." Boyd's face went red. His hands gripped the armrests, and for just a second I saw it again. The same look from my porch, the cold behind his eyes. "That's not true," Boyd said. His voice cracked on the last word. The older juror in the front row, the one who'd looked down at his hands when Boyd talked about wanting to move on, was now studying him. Finch let the cracked voice hang in the air. Then he turned to the jury one final time. He didn't raise his voice. "My client did what Boyd Lachlan did. He had a moment where he lost control. The difference is that every person in this room understands why. You don't have to agree with what he did. You just have to ask yourself one honest question. If this system says a man can beat a stranger and walk free because of a temporary break, then can a father who watched that happen to his daughter, who sat in that hospital, who heard that verdict, who watched that man go back to living while his little girl couldn't walk to her car alone, can that father receive the same grace?" He sat down. The Lachlan attorney's closing tried to rebuild what Finch had torn apart, but the words sounded hollow now, like he was reading from a script that no longer matched the play. Finch's closing was short. He repeated the question. That's all he did. He asked it again and sat down. The jury went out to deliberate. Rena was behind me. Kieran was next to her. The first hour went by, then the second. Somewhere in the third hour, the bailiff said they had a verdict. The jury filed back in. The foreperson stood. She was the woman from the back row, the one who'd been watching Boyd fall apart on the stand. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. She unfolded the paper and said, "Not guilty." Rena grabbed my arm. Kieran's hand landed on my shoulder from behind. Across the aisle, Boyd's father stood up, turned, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Boyd stayed in his chair, staring at the table in front of him. His lawyers worked around him like he was a piece of furniture. We walked out together. Boyd was still staring at the table when the door closed behind us.